On a un second intervenant dans cette première moitié de l'après-midi, c'est Ben Williams, alors qui lui nous a donné un titre en français, mais qui va parler en anglais. Mais Ben Williams, pour faire de la symétrique, Ben Williams vient d'Afrique du Sud, où il travaille alors, à l'intersection de l'édition, de la diffusion et de la technologie digitale. Il est le fondateur et le fondateur littéraire de BookLIVE, qui est d'Afrique du Sud, un site internet, enfin vous allez en parler beaucoup mieux que moi, donc il est le fondateur littéraire et celui qui gère BookLIVE, et il travaille en étroite proximité avec le groupe Transmedia dans le domaine donc de l'information, de l'information de mi-information, de mi-commerce. Et il est en plus, particulièrement impliqué dans les questions environnementales et un spécialiste du réchauffement climatique et des changements climatiques. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous articulez les deux. En tout cas, aujourd'hui, vous allez nous parler de l'édition numérique en Afrique du Sud, Media and Models, l'avenir du livre à l'ère des griots modulaires.
Merci. Thanks very much for having me. Like an earlier speaker, I spent the night rewriting my paper. And I'm kind of glad I did because it syncs up pretty nicely with what Tariq has just gone through. That was a magnificent piss take, by the way. I really enjoyed your presentation quite a bit. Well done. And I rewrote my paper to emphasize the third of the three subjects that I meant to talk about, the activiste versus griot sort of dynamic, because it's relevant to what's happening in South Africa right now. So yes, I'm a potted biography of myself. I'm originally from the United States, but I've lived in South Africa for 20 years. I founded the country's largest website dedicated to books. It's called BookLIVE. You can visit the website there. I also publish books, and I have published a book myself of experimental fiction and also a cookbook. And I'm very interested in the new forms of literature that the era of digital promises, even though we haven't seen very many of them yet. So here's my sole connection to the Sorbonne. Jacques Derrida visited Cape Town in 1997, and I took this photograph of him. It was quite a nice moment. It's quite a nice photograph, if I do say so myself. What struck me most about Jacques Derrida was how well he posed for photographs. He really knew how to do it. His talk was on the politics of forgiveness. And in typical Derridian style, he concluded that only the unforgivable could be forgiven. And so I'm from Africa, to which many unforgivable things have been done. And since Africa is something of an unknown quantity in this context, let me digress a little bit to sketch a wider picture of technology on our continent. So let's consider a moment the view of Africa from what I call the Silicon West. Here is a montage of images that you randomly come across if you search for world maps and technology. So where are the gaps? I'll give you a hint. There are gaps. These gaps are more indicative of a lack of imagination on the part of map makers than on the true state of technology in Africa, however. It's a case, sadly, of the dark continent trope repeating itself. Here's a sample of some of the goings-on in Silicon Africa, as opposed to the Silicon West, where locally developed digital businesses are flourishing. These are a bunch of medium-sized businesses that I've had some dealings with in the last couple of years. And I've left out all the bigger ones, like this one. Has anybody here heard of Naspers? Naspers? Yeah. So Naspers is a publishing company. It started as a printer for newspapers. But it invested a couple of years ago in a company called Tencent, which helped get WeChat and Alibaba.com off the ground. And Naspers is actively involved in the management of those two humongous digital businesses. So one of my jobs as I go around and talk about Africa and tech is to change people's perceptions. We are, in fact, right at the forefront of of what's going on. And these are the hubs of digital innovation that I could find when I just did sort of a bit of a random search and started putting dots on the map. Interestingly, note how many of the hubs are at the coast. And one of the reasons is that's where the undersea cables land. So the hubs are most proximate to where the actual fiber optic cable comes in. But the most important fact about Africa when it comes to digital and literature is this. Oh no, sorry. So let's just go through a couple of stats. Here we have Africa's got 1 billion people. It's got a lot of fast-growing economies. There are more mobile phones than people in Africa. And there are at least 30% smartphone penetration, 450 million internet connections, and if you want to get rich in Africa, get into education, because everybody wants to get an education. So that's just a quick potted look. But this is what's most important for me, is because there are 1 billion cell phones in Africa, the most important fact about it when it comes to digital and literature is that everyone can do it. Everyone can compose text. Even if they're not literate, they can compose text. And so the span of literary digital culture is actually quite continent-wide because of the penetration of connectivity, of cell phone connectivity on the continent. Now, j'habite en Afrique du Sud, ici, and it has the most developed market for books in the entire continent. It's got the biggest market. So let's take a quick look at this. We have 50 million people in the country. That's about 16 million less than France. But there are only 1 million book buyers in South Africa. That's different from readers, of course. It's important to distinguish between book buyers and readers because books are luxury objects in South Africa. Most people are poor, and the price of books is very high. The 1 million people who do spend a lot per person. They support an entire literary culture through their spending. And this situation is what has given rise to certain problems, which I'll get into just now. So what do the people who buy books in South Africa read? Well, we mostly read adult nonfiction, fiction, and then you can see adult nonfiction and fiction are the biggest ones. We also read far more international books than local books, so it's an import culture. So we import our texts and read them. And we have a high degree of e-book penetration in South Africa amongst the 1 million people. And one of the reasons is because, of course, Kindles are luxury items just like books in South Africa. So if you can afford a book, you can also afford an Amazon Kindle. So a lot of people get their Kindles instead of their books, and 35% of formal sector reading is done on devices. And of course, Amazon is the biggest, and there are a couple of smaller e-tailers which sort of take a little bit of market away. So another salient point is the languages of publishing in the formal trade sector. We have 11 official languages in South Africa, but only 2 publishing languages, English and Afrikaans. Afrikaans is a Dutch derivative language, very beautiful language actually, but it accounts for 35% of our formal market. And so all of that culture, all of that economic activity has allowed us to do this. We have 5 literary publishers, we have 5 major academic presses, we have about 50 novels a year. Imagine if France only produced 50 novels a year. We have about 50 novels a year. We have about 100 black and white nonfiction and academic titles. These are original. And we have 5 major literary festivals, and we have a whole bunch of small literary initiatives, which I'll get into now. So because of these 1 million people who buy books, we have a digital literary ecosystem. And it's basically about solving problems. So how do you popularize South African storytelling? Well, some people got together and created Long Story Short, which is famous people in South Africa reading short stories aloud and putting it on YouTube. So you sort of get your South African literature on YouTube through Long Story Short. How do you get kids to read and write? Well, we've developed Funza, which is a mobile reading and writing community. And if you go there, it's amazing. Thousands and thousands of kids are reading each other's 1001 Arabian Nights. They write romantic serials, and also contributing. It's quite an amazing platform. How do you find parents children's books in their own languages? Well, puku.koza has been built to do that. It's a multilingual children's books resource. If you're a parent and you want a children's book in Xhosa or Zulu or whatever, you can go to Puku and find out the one that's best for you. LitNet is the biggest literary website in South Africa, and it's almost exclusively in Afrikaans. How do you create a hybrid print-digital outlets for fine writing? Well, we have a whole bunch of small magazines. These are probably the most prominent. Aerodrome, Proofrock, and Uflanga, they're small independent initiatives, and they're there for fine writing. This is my favorite book and book digital initiative in South Africa. It's called Book Dash. It is a startup that creates children's books in a day. So you get 3 or 4 writers, 3 or 4 illustrators, and a couple of publishers and a couple of printers together, and for 8 hours you make children's books, and at the end of it you have 5 children's books printed and ready to be delivered to libraries. It's quite an amazing thing. It's called Book Dash. We also have a fantastic local ebook service which is taking market share away from Amazon. It's called Snaplify. And then this is the website that I built. We are trying to get more of those million people to buy South African books, and BookLIVE is the solution for that. But this is the problem that we're all sitting with right now, and as you can see, it's a blank slide. Here, everything changes. As an introduction to this slide, let me just say, we all know that they say there's an app for everything, but some problems can't be solved by apps. And apps or digital platforms, disruptive or enhancing though they may be, can't compare to the disruption of an idea whose time has come, which is the kind of disruption that everything that has preceded this slide, the entire books and literary value chain in South Africa, is currently facing. 2015 is the year that Frans Fanon has arrived in South Africa, and his presence is going to have a long-term effect on our literary culture, print and digital alike. The question is, how do you solve the problem of decolonizing South African literature? Here's the current debate. On the one hand, we have colonialism and apartheid. Everybody here must know about apartheid. It was one of the worst social systems ever invented. It kept blacks and whites separate, very to the benefit of the whites and to the detriment of the blacks. And it founded everything that's happening economically in South Africa. Everything comes from apartheid in South Africa, including South African publishing and bookselling. So there's a great degree of overlap between apartheid, colonialism, and our literary value chain. Over here we have black literary self-determination, which has no part of these two things. There is no such thing as black literary self-determination in South Africa, because the entire structure of publishing, bookselling, and literature is supported by the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. So in short, in a black majority country, we have a system that excludes black literary self-determination. The publishers are white, the editors are white, the agents are white, the distributors are white, the booksellers are white, the book's editors are white, that's me. And though this is changing somewhat, the book buyers, the people who buy the books, are also largely white. The writers are black. You can write and be black. You can't be any of the other things and be black. So in 2015, some 21 years after the advent of democracy in South Africa, we now have a name for the state of affairs. Thanks to these new literary activists who have hit the scene this year, they call it the white literary system. As a system, it's not unique in South Africa. Most of South Africa's economic infrastructure arises from apartheid and before that, colonialism. Another term that some people use is white supremacy. And for the first time, this system is being challenged on a structural basis, and as a result, we have a rupture in our literary world. Now, there is one place where these two things do overlap, and that's digital culture and the marketplace of ideas. Because black people are expressing themselves online. And publishers, white publishers and booksellers are interested in selling ebooks. So there is something of a continuum there in that both are trying to access the possibilities of digital. And perhaps there is some space there where post-rupture commonality can be found. But just as the white it's worth going through a timeline of what's happened in South Africa recently. So we had our democratic elections in 1994. In 2006, all the projects that I've been referencing to you had their start, including BookLIVE. In September 2011, we had Occupy Wall Street. July 2013, Black Lives Matter. I didn't put in the Arab Spring stuff, but it also belongs on the map. And then that has led us to September 2014, where at one of our literary festivals, an author called Tondo Ngolozana expressed his dissatisfaction with the white literary system. That was shortly followed by our version of Black Lives Matter, which is called Rhodes Must Fall, as in Cecil John Rhodes. And then at another literary festival in May, the same novelist, Tondo Ngolozana, withdrew from the white literary system. He made a public statement and he said he will no longer participate. The hashtag changed to hashtag #LitApartheid. We had a discussion at Wits University. Something positive, in September 2015, the launch of Blackbird Books, which is the first publishing house in South Africa's history, which has a black publisher. And, but I've just come now from another festival called the Open Book Festival, where we didn't have the lit-apartheid discussion. We had a little bit of it, but not on a robust basis, which for me points to the permanentization of the rupture, and that's the problem. And this is what the crisis looks like for South African literature, and I think it can be transposed to other literatures in the world. And I think this is where digital and print I think this is where digital triumphs over print. Because on the one hand, we have a delegitimized value chain continuing to produce literary artifacts, books, in the same manner that it has done for 20 years. These artifacts are produced or transcribed at what might be called the archive of our democracy, which includes the stuff that came before it, apartheid and colonialism. But these artifacts are concerned with the colony and the post-colony. Those are the two concepts that define the limits of our books. They are produced because they still have economic currency, people will still buy them, even though their political currency has been fatally undermined. On the other hand, we have writers who have excluded themselves from co-option by the white literary system, taking on the business of decolonizing literature, without money, without infrastructure, with very little but their own words, which are shared and amplified digitally. So we have the publishers and booksellers busy trying to explain democracy to themselves through the publication of books. And we have writers busy trying to decolonize our literature. As a case in the latter, I was on Facebook last night, and I learned about the Soweto Abantu Books Festival, a blacks-only literary event that happens each December in the historic Johannesburg township of Soweto. Except it is wholly made up. It is a fiction. It exists as a recent post on Facebook written by Tondo Ngolozana, but because of the political agency of the writer who is saying, the emperor has no clothes, the made-up festival is almost as destabilizing materially in real life as if it were a real festival. The fake blacks-only festival is as destabilizing to the white literary system as a real blacks-only festival would be. The rupture with the very ideas of the colony and the post-colony is quite evident here. The digital decolonizers are not circumscribed by the past or even the present. They are instead concerned with the liberated future. They're about liberation and about the future. They are not waiting for their freedom to be given to them by the archivists, the people who are busy transcribing democracy by publishing books. But they are instead writing it into existence with their own non-archivable, ephemeral online texts. The tweets come and go, the Facebook posts come and go, but the declarations stay, and they are having a massively destabilizing effect on the entire edifice of literature in South Africa. So, happily for me, the recent developments sync with a theory that I've had for a couple of years now, which I informally call the theory of the mobile griot. A griot, of course, is an African storyteller. They come from oral culture. They carry people's myths and histories in their poems and stories. They are academics, they are entertainers, they are loved, and they are feared. In the digital age, there's something new about storytelling which enables a new kind of griot, but it's not to do with the transmission side of the equation. That is, it's not to do with the new tools that are available to storytellers, even though the latest cell phones are amazing instruments for the invention of narrative. Instead, what's revolutionary about the digital age vis-a-vis narrative and storytelling is on the receiving end of the equation. It's the ability to conjure audiences from thin air that's new. It's the power to raise up listeners for our stories without the services of publishers that's the game changer. For everything we post online, there is a vast resting potential for its reception, an unactivated audience that will respond with immense power once it's stirred. In a sense, every one of us who uses a cell phone is a griot mobile. Your social network is your audience, and you communicate with your audience by your own digital orality. Text that is marked by its conversational tone. Text that is speech, in effect. And by its economy of exchange. You post a status and you get a like. So, but hashtag Black Lives Matter is a phenomenon of the mobile griot. Hashtag Rose Must Fall is a phenomenon of the mobile griot. My colleague Sukanta Chaudhry earlier repeated the famous question, if the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre, where's Hamlet? Well, where is hashtag Black Lives Matter? It's in its audience. The power of the narrative lies in the digital audience. In my theory, as the age of the mobile griot gathers momentum, something happens to narrative that is produced inside books, whether they be print books or digital books or both. Namely, it becomes politically marginalized. The narrative in the book is no longer the thing that counts, because what counts is found in the conversations on the screen. It is the ephemeral that is paramount. Continuing with my theory, eventually, economics will catch up with politics. Books will increasingly become prestige artifacts instead of commercial propositions. It doesn't mean that books will go out of business, but it portends a retreat. Books will be on the defensive in the age of the mobile griot. Those who make books, us, will need to withdraw into our lagers, our fortresses, our walled gardens, in order to remain viable, because in those reduced ecosystems we can continue to publish on our own terms. And in short, audience is the new zero-sum game of politics. So audience is the new zero-sum game of publishing. Audience is the new zero-sum game of literature. And it's the mobile griot that is loosening the grip of the book on it at the expense of the archivists. So we go back to the problem. Perhaps the solution to the problem of decolonizing South African literature is supplied by the phenomenon of the mobile griot. Perhaps it is not to raise the white literary system to the ground by replacing white publishers with black publishers, white booksellers with black booksellers, and so on. Instead, perhaps black literary self-determination will be realized through the ongoing invention of digital texts and conversations that resist reification as a commercial book, which in South Africa means something that's part of the white literary system, something that comes from apartheid and colonialism, and thus something that is politically illegitimate, as we have seen. The mobile griot have the power to aggregate the audience that matters the most through their narratives. They have the political agency, and the more audience they aggregate, the more black literary self-determination will come into being. Of course, I could be entirely wrong. And the idea of self-determination through the development of digital audience is mere fantasy, in part because it comes without an economic infrastructure, and because the publishing value chain is more or less permanently entrenched in white capitalist structures, and thus immovable, irresistible as the owner of South African letters. But I have faith. I think it will come about one way or another. Change is certainly in the air in South Africa. In the context of a dozen innovation hubs dedicated to empowering Africans digitally, and 1 billion Africans telling stories every hour of the day on their mobiles, I think it must come. I'd like to conclude with a parable from the 19th century about a prophetess called Nongqawuse. Nongqawuse rose to prominence amongst the section of the Xhosa people who lived near the Xhosa River in what is now South Africa. Nongqawuse had a vision. If the Xhosa slaughtered their cattle, which is the equivalent of all of us withdrawing our money and burning it, then the Xhosa people's ancestors would rise from the dead and drive the colonizing British, who were exerting enormous destroying pressure on them, into the sea. And it happened partially. The Xhosas slaughtered all their cattle. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of cattle were slaughtered in the 1850s. But, of course, the ancestors did not arise. And the Xhosas reaped famine instead of freedom. I mention this parable because an important novelist in South Africa called Ahmad Dangor, whose Bitter Fruit I recommend very much, he's used it in the context of the debate about the white literary system. His concern is that if black literary self-determination is achieved at the expense of the current book's setup, then all that will happen is a literary famine. And his concern is shared by many writers, black and white, and of course is scorned by many others, black and white. But it counts as a provocation for us when we consider the way forward. The provocation is essentially a ghost story with two possible outcomes. A ghost story in which the present rupture makes ghosts of the writers of post-apartheid. Everybody who's published a book in the last 20 years has done so through the white literary system. Are they to become ghosts because of the political illegitimacy of the system that produced their books? Or are the decolonizers, the people who are currently raising the problem and confronting us, are they the ghosts? Are they the beautiful ones? If you haven't read Ai Kwe Armaz's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, it's a key African novel, and I recommend to you. And that's how he spells the word beautiful. Are they the beautiful ones who are finally born and are going to haunt the old paradigm into the sea? That's the one that we hope for. Just as a coda, I'd like to give you a couple of appendices. I gather this presentation will be published somewhere, right? So here are some novels from the white literary system, many of them written by black people, that have been published in the last 20 years that I recommend. And here are some nonfiction, works of nonfiction that I also recommend. These are the people to follow if you want to follow the white literary system debates in South Africa. Most tweeting is done in English, so you can follow it that way, although sometimes it's in Zulu, Xhosa, or Pedi. Again, I leave this for you to refer back to later. And then lastly, just a small project that I'm working on, being a digital person. It's a project called Possessed. It's meant to help the mobile griot make money out of their creativity. It's a micro-literature digital exchange. It's supposed to enable experimental and collaborative literary remixing. And we use the QR code as an objet du désir, kind of like the moment that book is an objet du désir. And it's coming in October 2016. So please look out for that. Merci.
Thank you very much for your presentation, which in fact indeed follows very nicely perhaps because what you also stress is the subversive, to use Perhac's term, potential, or the destabilizing, to use one of your terms, effect of the digital market and the digital marketplace of ideas. So I know that we are short on time, so I'll turn to the audience right away and ask if there are any questions for you.
Just two requests for information. One is, am I right in thinking that there is no publishing at all in the African languages?
There is a lot of publishing in African languages, but it is not trade publishing. So, in other words, the government will publish novels in African language for distribution into government distribution circles, but you can't buy that isiZulu book in the bookshop. You know. A lot of educational publishing is done in the vernacular. But if you want a novel, if you want a work of sanctioned literature by a South African novelist, white, black, Indian, what have you, it has to, you find that in a bookshop, and it is pumped through a white publisher into a white bookshop, basically.
My other question is, of the billion plus mobile phones in Africa, what proportion are smartphones?
30%. I had that in the slide. It's about 30% and it's growing. The key thing that has driven that in Africa is the advent of the $100 cell phone, $100 smartphone. So you get an Android smartphone that's $100, which is pretty cheap, and a lot of people can afford that, and so they're going and getting these extremely inexpensive Chinese smartphones that are flooding into Africa. So it's 30% now. Tomorrow it'll be 31%. I mean, it's growing that fast. The next day it'll be 32%, and eventually there won't be non-smartphones.
I'm just really intrigued. It's quite fascinating. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. But I was intrigued also a little bit by the digital archive as just a permanent, you know, and the ephemeral on the other hand.
Yeah.
And it just sort of, what's interesting obviously in some ways is that the oral has a tremendous form of permanency with slight variations. There's techniques, mnemonics, and so on and so forth, ways of transmission. That also becomes a particular way of archiving. That's how a lot of very long stuff have survived.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you just kind of insisted at one point in your presentation on this kind of divide.
Yeah, for me, it's a case of quantity and scale. You will be able to archive everything that is published online if you want to. But that would also be the same as trying to archive the world. There's so much, where do you begin with say, hashtag Black Lives Matter? You could probably archive hashtag Roads Must Fall because it's smaller, and it's only been going a couple of months. But eventually, I think it supersedes, and I think that, I think that the ephemeral nature is actually sort of what drives the excitement. It's sort of what gives it its potency. The fact of the leak is one of the things that contributes to the excitement of the leak. You know? Thanks. Autre question? Donc, merci.
So why can't the government printed local languages and books be sold in bookstores?
There's no market for them. Yeah. The reason that in South Africa you can't get a commercially viable Zulu novel or Xhosa novel is because the audience doesn't have the purchasing power to make it viable to the publisher to publish it. So the system is quite tight in that respect. You have to develop books for audiences. And so one of the things that people have been saying in South Africa is Long Walk to Freedom, the great biography by Nelson Mandela, for example, is an illegitimate text because it was published by people who became prosperous and developed their systems during the worst human rights regime ever. And that's a challenge that people are saying, that people are coming up with. And of course, the people who are published in the white literary system are responding fairly aggressively and saying, no, the novel I wrote is the novel that I wish to write, and I'm not a toy or tool or co-opted by the white literary system. I'm lucky to be published at all, in fact. But the people who are challenging the white literary system are saying, some people would call it throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but some people are saying, no, we must find new forms, and we must find new values, new value systems, new value chains, and achieve self-determination. That's the thing, is that black writing has no self-determination in South Africa.
Oui. Et pour une simple question en français, on peut peut-être la traduire. En France, il existe un soutien, enfin, il y a ce qu'on appelle le CNL en France, le Centre National des Lettres, qui soutient en fait l'édition de différentes manières. Est-ce qu'il y a des organismes en Afrique du Sud qui soutiennent une écriture noire et une écriture blanche? Et est-ce que derrière il y a toujours des enjeux de rapport de force, idéologiques? Ou au contraire, est-ce qu'il y a une politique d'État aussi qui encourage le développement d'une écriture noire en fait, puisque je reprends vos catégories qui pour nous sont, je vous dis très nettement, sont très surprenantes en fait. Aussi par ailleurs, ça reflète un état de société. Et ma question porte sur l'existence ou la non-existence d'une politique d'État qui encouragerait ce développement.
Our government will tell you that there is one. But no, in reality there isn't. There's a network of libraries, and our national library, our Bibliothèque Nationale, is a publishing house as well. And it publishes books mostly in African languages. And then it occasionally distributes them to other libraries. But if you ask the writers who want black literary self-determination to come about, they will tell you there's nothing. They will say that there's no support, that the government is more taken up with lining its own sort of pockets, rather than trying to help help a new kind of South African literature arise. So there isn't. In theory there is, but in practice there isn't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Merci. Là, je crois que vous pouvez remercier.